They thought she was just a quiet mother, a history teacher with nothing but words and patience. But when Bruce Donovan, the arrogant master of the dojo, charged at her in a blind fury, Vanessa didn't flinch. She didn't shout. With one swift, effortless motion, she sent him crashing to the mat in front of the very crowd that once doubted her. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a woman defending her pride. This was a warrior reclaiming her place in the world. Behind her modest life was a hidden past as a Delta Force operative, known to few as the Phantom. But more than her military prowess, Vanessa carried a deeper strength, the kind forged not in war but in dignity and resilience. This is a story about respect, redemption, and the power of standing tall when the world expects you to shrink. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell so you never miss the next one. In the heart of a bustling American city stood Donovan Martial Arts Academy, a place wrapped in reputation and whispers. Locals called it the Forge, a place where raw ambition was hammered into sharp discipline, where young fighters were either broken or built into champions. Its walls, lined with aged photos and dusty trophies, held countless stories of sweat, bruises, and glory, but also, quietly, stories of those who never made it because they didn't fit the mold. Among the steady stream of parents and students, Vanessa Carter often went unnoticed. At 42, Vanessa blended into the background with a quiet grace, her curly hair tied in a low bun, her eyes observant but guarded. She was a high school history teacher, a single mother navigating life with an easy humility. No one at the academy knew she had once been far more than just Malik's mom. None suspected that beneath her soft-spoken demeanor lived the steel and precision of a former Delta Force operative, once known on covert missions as the Phantom. A shadow on the battlefield, a whisper of death to enemies, a protector in the darkest corners of the world. But Vanessa had buried that part of herself long ago when personal tragedy broke through her armor. She had traded battlefields for classrooms, fatigues for cardigans, and the sharpness of a soldier's edge for the gentle patience of a mother. She was determined to raise her son away from the ghosts of her past, giving him a life untainted by violence. Her son, Malik Carter, was 15, a bright, eager teenager with a quiet fire in his heart. He had taken up martial arts at Donovan's not just to learn how to fight, but to build confidence, discipline, and identity. But the dojo wasn't the refuge they'd hoped for. Malik faced the subtle, searing sting of racial bias every time he stepped onto the mat. His efforts were constantly overshadowed, his progress quietly undermined, and praise was reserved for students who looked nothing like him. The source of this was none other than Bruce Donovan, the academy's master instructor. At 48, Bruce carried himself like a self-appointed king of the dojo, a white man with a polished black belt, years of training under his belt, and an ego heavier than any of his trophies. He was once an MMA fighter, but despite his skills, he'd never quite made it to the top. That bitterness fermented into arrogance, and beneath his veneer of discipline lurked a quiet prejudice he never bothered to fully hide. Bruce had an unspoken rule. Only certain students earned his respect, and it was no secret that Malik, and others like him, would never make that list. His smirks, his backhanded compliments, the way he corrected Malik twice as harshly as others, all of it painted an invisible line of exclusion. Vanessa watched it all, her military-trained eyes catching every slight, every microaggression, even when others didn't. She swallowed her indignation each time, reminding herself she was no longer that soldier, no longer the Phantom. She was just a mother. But deep down, in the silence of those fluorescent-lit halls, a storm was brewing inside her. And soon, neither Bruce nor the dojo would ever see her the same way again. Vanessa Carter knew her place at Donovan Martial Arts Academy, not by any rule written on paper, but by the way people looked past her. Every evening after school, she would pull up quietly in her aging sedan, park in the far corner of the lot, and wait inside until her son, Malik, emerged with his gym bag slung over his shoulder, his face a mix of exhaustion and restraint. Sometimes he'd talk, sometimes he wouldn't, but Vanessa had served in enough war zones to read between silences. She knew something was off, even if Malik never outright said it. She tried not to interfere. After all, wasn't this supposed to be his journey, a place where he could carve his own sense of strength? She didn't want to be that parent, the one who hovered, who fought their kids' battles. She'd fought enough of her own. But it got harder to stay uninvolved with each passing week. She noticed how Bruce Donovan, the Academy's revered instructor, treated Malik differently. It was subtle, calculated. A correction too sharp here, a dismissal too quick there. And then there was the praise, lavishly doled out to the white students, even when their form was sloppier, their strikes weaker. Malik trained harder than most, yet acknowledgement was like a prize just out of reach, dangled but never given. Vanessa watched all of it from the periphery, her instincts screaming, but she swallowed it as she'd trained herself to do. You're just a mom now, she'd remind herself. Let it be. One evening, though, her resolve began to fracture. She had arrived a little earlier than usual, intending to catch the tail end of Malik's session. She sat on a wooden bench near the entrance, reading a paperback to pass the time. But when she overheard Bruce's voice, low but not low enough, the words sliced through the air sharper than any blade she'd ever faced. This is a dojo, not a charity parade, Bruce muttered to one of his assistant instructors, loud enough to carry. We're here to make warriors, not to put on some diversity showcase. If they can't cut it, that's not my problem. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the book. She felt the blood pulse in her ears, the old heat, the kind that once pushed her through battlefield firefights, stirring deep in her chest. She kept her eyes on the page, pretending to read, but every nerve in her body stood on alert. She'd spent a lifetime reading threats, and Bruce's tone wasn't just dismissive, it was contemptuous. Then Bruce added, with a sneer that made her skin prickle, I mean, let's be honest. Some folks just aren't made for this kind of discipline. It's in the blood, you know. The assistant instructor chuckled awkwardly, but Vanessa heard no humor in it, just complicity. She stared at the words on her page, the black ink blurring as her vision trembled with fury she hadn't felt in years. The military had trained her to assess threats, calculate responses, act only when necessary. But nothing in her training prepared her for hearing such poison directed indirectly, yet unmistakably, at her son, and kids like him. She wanted to storm onto the mat, call Bruce out right then and there, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity she'd always tried to teach Malik. Perhaps it was the part of her that knew. If she was going to confront this, it had to be at the right time, in the right way, not just for Malik, but for every kid in that dojo who'd ever been made to feel less than. So she stayed seated, outwardly calm, inwardly seething. She watched Malik finish his drills, his form clean, his focus steady, despite the shadows cast around him. But that night, when they got in the car, Vanessa gripped the steering wheel tighter than she needed to. She drove in silence, the city lights flickering across her windshield, but the words Bruce had spoken echoed louder than traffic. And in the quiet of her heart, something ancient stirred, not the soldier she used to be, not the phantom she thought she'd buried, but the mother who knew that some battles still had to be fought, especially when the war came to your child's doorstep. She said nothing aloud, but the decision had already taken root. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The invitation arrived in the form of a printed flyer Malik brought home, crumpled in his gym bag. a formal notice for the Donovan Martial Arts Academy end-of-season exhibition and awards ceremony, an event where families could gather to celebrate the students' progress, watch friendly demonstrations, and hear the usual speeches from Bruce Donovan himself. Vanessa had nearly tossed the flyer aside, as she did with most school and extracurricular announcements. But that night, after replaying Bruce's poisonous remarks in her mind over and over, something inside her told her to go. The evening of the event, the academy was buzzing with excitement. Rows of folding chairs filled the perimeter of the sparring floor, where the blue mats stretched wide under harsh fluorescent lights. Parents chatted in small clusters, some in their Sunday best, others in gym clothes, while the students, clad in their GAs, fidgeted with belts or practiced kicks in the corners. The air hummed with anticipation. Vanessa sat alone near the back, as she always did. She wore her usual neutral attire, jeans, a dark sweater, her hair neatly pulled back. She looked every bit the modest history teacher, the quiet parent observing from a safe distance. But inside her, that history wasn't made of dates and dusty lessons. It was a legacy of grit, combat, and the weight of life-or-death decisions. She watched Bruce Donovan prowl the room, greeting parents with a politician's smile, his posture that of a man who owned every inch of space around him. Then, just as the demonstrations wound down and Bruce stood to deliver his closing speech, the atmosphere shifted. His voice echoed confidently through the room, his words full of bravado about discipline, perseverance, and what it really takes to be a fighter. Vanessa recognized the cadence, not unlike the empty pep talks she'd heard from superior officers who'd never seen real combat. Then came the moment that would change everything. Bruce's eyes swept the crowd, pausing with a smirk when they landed on her. "You know," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "we spend so much time teaching these kids discipline, but sometimes I wonder what their parents are learning. Take Malik's mom, for instance." Heads turned. Vanessa felt every gaze land on her like a sudden spotlight. "Ms. Carter," Bruce continued, his grin wide and cutting, "you're a history teacher, right? How about we make a little history tonight? Care to join me on the mat for a friendly demonstration?" The crowd chuckled, some awkwardly, others with genuine amusement. Malik froze beside his classmates, his face draining of color. "Come on now," Bruce teased. "I'll go easy, I promise. Unless, of course, you're afraid of a little exercise." A few parents chuckled louder at that. Vanessa smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but calculation. She stood, her movements calm and deliberate, every eye tracking her as she stepped forward. She faced Bruce with the steady patience of a woman who'd seen much worse men than him fall apart under pressure. "I'll accept," she said evenly, her voice neither meek nor boastful, "but on one condition." The murmurs grew. Bruce raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained. "A condition? Do tell." Vanessa's eyes didn't flinch. She kept them locked on his, her expression the same cool neutrality she'd worn stepping into enemy territory years before. "If I win," she said, her voice clear as glass, "you step down as head instructor, effective immediately, and the parents here form a council to appoint a replacement, someone fair." The room went still, the chuckles died. Even Bruce's smirk faltered for a half-second before he laughed. "Well," he bellowed, "don't we have a fiery one?" He turned to the crowd, his arms wide like a showman, feeding off their energy. "You all heard her. She wants me to put my title on the line, against a history teacher." The crowd stirred, some snickering, others whispering in curiosity. "But what do I get when I win, Miss Carter?" Bruce taunted, leaning closer. "What does the brave historian wager in return?" Vanessa didn't blink. She didn't need to. "You'll get the satisfaction of having tried your hardest," she said softly, "and the lesson that appearances can be deceiving." A few gasps, a few amused snorts. But something in her tone, something unshakable, settled like a weight in the room. Bruce chuckled again, but it lacked the bite it carried before. He was intrigued now, his curiosity piqued in spite of himself. "Fine," he said with a theatrical bow. "Tomorrow evening, right here, let's give these good people a show." Vanessa nodded, her eyes steady, then turned and walked back to her seat. Malik's eyes were wide with fear and disbelief, but Vanessa gently squeezed his shoulder when she passed, her eyes telling him what her voice didn't. "Trust me." The storm was no longer brewing. It was on its way. That night, long after Malik had gone to bed and the house had settled into a heavy quiet, Vanessa sat alone by the living room window, staring out at the darkened street beyond. A half-empty cup of tea cooled on the coffee table, forgotten. The lamplight behind her cast a soft glow, but it wasn't enough to push back the shadows creeping into her mind. She hadn't planned to say yes to Bruce Donovan's challenge. That wasn't supposed to be her life anymore. She was a mother, a teacher, a civilian. She had worked hard to bury that other woman, the one the world once called the Phantom. But when she looked into Bruce's eyes in that dojo, all that arrogance, that sneering contempt, it was the same look she'd seen before, in war zones, in enemies who thought they understood power simply because they could throw a punch or fire a gun. Vanessa leaned back, closing her eyes, and the memories came faster than she could stop them. She remembered the first time they'd given her that nickname, the Phantom. It wasn't just because she moved like a ghost in combat, but because no one ever saw her coming. A shadow in the dead of night, precise, efficient, untraceable. She had led countless missions deep behind enemy lines, missions no one talked about, not even in the halls of the Pentagon. Delta Force didn't leave paper trails. But the ghosts she carried didn't come from the missions she completed. They came from the ones she didn't. It had been a high-risk operation in a remote corner of Afghanistan, a raid to extract a kidnapped journalist held by a brutal insurgent faction. Vanessa had mapped every step, studied every escape route, accounted for every variable except the one she couldn't predict. A child no more than 8 had stumbled into the crossfire, startling her squad. That split second of hesitation was all it took. The trap was sprung. The ambush that followed was merciless. She still remembered the sounds, gunfire, shouting, the unmistakable final cries of her teammates. They got the journalist out, but at the cost of every soldier on her team except her. She made it back, but she carried their deaths like an unbearable weight strapped to her spine. The military called her a hero. Vanessa called herself a coward. She resigned within the year, disappeared from the service, changed cities, changed her name. She even swapped her surname to Carter, her mother's maiden name, just to stay hidden. She became Malik's mother, the teacher, the neighbor. She smiled politely at PTA meetings and kept her head down. But deep inside, the Phantom never left. She was just waiting in the dark. And now Bruce Donovan, with all his ignorance and cruelty, had woken her. Vanessa stood up and walked quietly to the old chest she kept in the back of her closet. Inside, beneath layers of blankets and old books, lay a small wooden box. She opened it slowly. There it was, her old Delta Force patch, the tarnished silver pin, and a photo of her squad, forever young, forever frozen in time. She touched the photo gently, her finger resting on each face she remembered. "I didn't fight then, I ran, but I'm not running this time," she whispered to them, her voice steady. "I owe you that much." Tomorrow she wasn't just stepping onto a mat. She was stepping back into herself. The next day arrived with an edge in the air, a stillness before a coming storm. Word of the upcoming match between Vanessa Carter and Bruce Donovan had spread like wildfire through the academy. By afternoon, the whispers had reached every parent, every student. Most couldn't believe it. A history teacher taking on the dojo's master. Others smelled something deeper, sensing in Vanessa's quiet confidence a story untold. But while the buzz swirled among the students, Bruce Donovan wasn't resting easy. Something about Vanessa's eyes haunted him, that unflinching calm. It wasn't the look of someone bluffing their way into a dare. It was something colder, sharper. So that morning, Bruce called over one of his most loyal students, Derek, a 20-something black belt who'd been with the academy since his teenage years. Derek was fiercely devoted, a man eager to please, willing to do what others wouldn't. "I want you to dig up what you can on her," Bruce said, his voice low and tight. "She's hiding something. I can feel it. She's just a teacher, right?" Derek shrugged. "Then prove me wrong," Bruce snapped. "Find out who she really is. Everyone has a past." By the end of the day, Derek came back, face pale, phone in hand. He showed Bruce the military records, the archived news snippets, the fragmentary references to Delta Force operations, redacted but unmistakable, and then a nickname that chilled even Derek, the Phantom. Bruce's stomach tightened. He scrolled through the sparse but telling records, covert missions, classified engagements, and whispers of her role in a rescue that had cost an entire team their lives, except for her, a ghost of the battlefield. Bruce's pride recoiled in the face of this revelation, but his ego refused to yield. He couldn't afford to lose to her. Not publicly, not ever. And so, instead of respecting the warning in those records, Bruce made a decision rooted in the very arrogance that defined him. That evening, as the academy emptied and the fluorescent lights dimmed, Bruce waited for Vanessa in the locker corridor, the place between the mats and the back exit. Quiet, private, just dark enough to feel oppressive. Vanessa walked through with her gym bag slung over her shoulder, ready to collect Malik. She barely glanced at Bruce as she passed, but his voice stopped her. "We need to talk." She paused, turned slowly, her face a mask of composure. "About what?" she asked, though she already knew. Bruce took a step closer, his voice low, sharp with threat. "I know who you are." "Do you?" Vanessa replied mildly, her eyebrow arching. "Delta Force," he hissed. "The Phantom. That's your real past, isn't it?" Vanessa didn't blink. She watched him carefully, assessing not just his words, but the trembling behind his bravado. "Congratulations," she said coolly. "You did your homework." Bruce's face twisted, the smug grin barely hiding his discomfort. "You think that's gonna scare me? You think the people here would still cheer for you if they knew you're a trained killer, pretending to be a school teacher?" Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. She took a step closer, her presence suddenly filling the narrow corridor. "You don't know a damn thing about me, Bruce," she said quietly, "but I know everything I need to know about you." Her voice was steady, unshaken, but Bruce wasn't finished. He leaned in, his whisper venomous. "If you win tomorrow, if you embarrass me in my own house, I'll make sure you and that kid of yours can't show your faces here again. I've got friends in this city. You'll be blacklisted from every school, every district. Malik will have no place here. That's a promise." For a flicker of a second, something dark crossed Vanessa's eyes. But it wasn't fear, it was calculation. She'd heard better threats, more creative ones in war zones. She'd stared down men who meant every word of their menace and left them gasping in the dust. "You want to threaten my son?" she said, her voice soft but cutting. "You have no idea who you're playing with, Bruce," he sneered, mistaking her calm for weakness. "I'll crush you on that mat, Vanessa, just like you crushed your squad," he spat. That landed like a slap. Vanessa's eyes darkened, the cold edge of her old self flickering just beneath the surface. But before she could respond, there was a sound behind the lockers. A slight rustle, barely audible, but enough to catch her attention. She tilted her head and spotted a shadow shift. Malik. He had been coming to find her, but hearing his mother's name, hearing Delta Force, the Phantom, crushed your squad. He froze. She could see the confusion, the fear in his eyes. Bruce didn't notice. He was too drunk on his own threat. "You don't belong here, Vanessa. Walk away now or lose everything." Vanessa's response was quiet, yet every word landed like steel. "I've faced warlords, assassins, and men who made you look like a child playing dress-up. You think I'm scared of a washed-up dojo tyrant? Go ahead, Bruce. Try me." Her eyes burned into his, unflinching. Then, with a slow, measured step, she turned and walked away. Not another word, not another glance back. But before she reached the exit, she paused and whispered just loud enough. "You don't get to decide who belongs here." Malik stepped out from his hiding spot, his face pale. Vanessa spotted him and softened instantly, her expression easing despite the storm swirling inside her. "You heard that?" she asked gently. Malik nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Is it true, all of it?" Vanessa exhaled, resting her hands on his shoulders. "Yeah, baby, some of it is. I'll explain everything later, but you don't need to worry." "He threatened you, us," she nodded. "I know, and that's exactly why I'm going to end this tomorrow, the right way." Malik looked into her eyes, and for the first time he saw a depth he couldn't name, something fierce, unshakable, like a sleeping lion finally stretching its limbs. Vanessa gave his shoulders a reassuring squeeze. "You're my son, Malik. You deserve to walk into that place without shame or fear, and tomorrow I'm going to make sure you can." Malik nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He'd always known his mom was strong, but he had no idea just how deep her strength ran. Together, they walked out into the night, the city lights flickering around them. The air was cooler now, crisp, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Tomorrow wasn't just a match anymore. It was a reckoning. The next evening, the dojo was packed beyond anything it had seen in years. Word had spread far beyond the academy walls. Students, parents, former trainees, even locals who'd never set foot in a dojo came to witness what was being called the David versus Goliath showdown. Except in this case, most folks were certain David didn't stand a chance. Vanessa stood by the entrance of the mat, her attire simple. Black sweatpants, a fitted gray t-shirt, and her hair pulled into a neat braid that traced down her back. No ceremony, no bravado, just readiness. But her eyes carried a chill that made a few parents glance twice and whisper among themselves. Malik stood near the crowd, eyes locked on his mother. He didn't speak, but his hands fidgeted restlessly, his stomach knotted with a mix of pride and fear. At the center of the mat, Bruce Donovan stretched with exaggerated flair, his black belt neatly tied, his gi pristine, every movement designed to showcase his form. His smile oozed with condescension, and his voice carried loud and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. What you're about to see is not just a friendly exhibition, but a lesson in the difference between training and wishful thinking." The crowd chuckled, though some exchanged uncertain glances. Vanessa's face remained still, unreadable. She stepped onto the mat with measured ease, her posture relaxed, yet composed. Bruce bowed, mockingly shallow. Vanessa returned the gesture, just enough to respect the ritual, but not the man. "You sure you're ready, Ms. Carter?" Bruce taunted loud enough for the spectators. "I'd hate for you to pull a muscle or two. I hear stretching's important at your age." Vanessa didn't reply. She simply stood, feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at her sides, watching him. Not his limbs, not his face, but his center of gravity, the way he breathed, the twitch of his muscles, all signs of what was to come. With a sudden shout, Bruce lunged forward, launching into a flurry of high, spinning kicks. Flashy, dramatic, textbook demonstrations of control and power. Each kick sliced through the air within inches of Vanessa, never making contact, but close enough to impress the crowd. Applause scattered across the room. "See that? Technique," Bruce boomed, "not just brute strength." Still, Vanessa didn't move beyond subtle shifts of weight. She wasn't there to dance for the crowd. She was there for the man's ego. Then Bruce slowed, faking a stumble as he landed from a high kick. He staggered, pretended to lose balance, presenting his side vulnerable, an invitation. The crowd gasped, sensing an opening. "Come on, Miss Carter," he sneered under his breath. "Take your shot. Let's give them a show." Vanessa stepped forward. Not hastily, not aggressively, just deliberate. She closed the gap between them, enough to make the air electric with tension. And then Bruce winked. It was a signal, not for her, but for the shadows lingering near the edges of the mat. In an instant, two of Bruce's most senior students, Derek and Nolan, sprang from the sidelines, both men lean, muscled, swift. They closed in from both flanks, pretending to intervene, as if to separate the fighters, but their intent was clear to anyone trained to see. They were coming for Vanessa. The crowd gasped, murmurs rippling like a sudden wind. Parents leaned forward, some confused, others alarmed, but most thought this was part of Bruce's plan for a real demonstration. Malik's breath caught in his throat. He started to move, but a hand from a nearby parent stopped him, whispering, "It's just part of the show, kid. Sit tight." But Malik knew better. His mother's stance shifted, not into retreat, but into something sharper, a predator's readiness. Derek reached her first, lunging with a sweeping leg strike meant to knock her off balance. Vanessa pivoted on the ball of her foot, her body low and centered, and in one smooth motion caught his leg mid-swing. Without breaking stride, she twisted at the hip, yanking Derek's body forward, his own momentum becoming his downfall. With a flick of her arm and a precise shift of weight, she drove him face first into the mat with a bone-rattling thud. Gasps erupted from the crowd. This was no staged fall. Derek groaned, trying to push himself up, but his limbs betrayed him. Nolan came next, more cautious but angrier. He aimed a high punch, followed by a knee intended for her ribs. Vanessa moved like water, fluid, efficient. She sidestepped the knee, caught his wrist mid-punch, and in one brutal, seamless motion, snapped his arm backward into a lock. The crack of joint pressure was audible even from the crowd. Nolan cried out, his knees buckling. Vanessa swept his legs from under him and sent him sprawling hard onto the mat beside his fallen comrade. The entire dojo fell into stunned silence. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the two men she'd just dismantled in under 10 seconds. Vanessa stood between them, her breath steady, her eyes cold as ice. She didn't gloat. She didn't pose. She simply stared at Bruce. And in that gaze, Bruce felt the facade slip. This wasn't a woman out of her depth. This wasn't a schoolteacher playing tough. This was a warrior, one who hadn't even broken a sweat. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, parents leaning to one another. Was that planned? She didn't even try. What just happened? Malik stood frozen, mouth slightly open, his heart pounding, not with fear anymore, but awe. Bruce's grin had vanished, his lips thinned into a pale line, his fists curling at his sides. This wasn't the way the night was supposed to go. The ambush was supposed to rattle her, humiliate her, let the crowd see her stumble, break her confidence, but she stood there like stone. For the first time, Bruce didn't see a teacher. He saw the phantom. But his pride, bruised, battered, refused to yield. He barked at the crowd. "You all came for a fight, didn't you? Then watch closely. Now we get serious." He stepped forward, his face red with anger, his body tensing like a coiled spring. But Vanessa didn't move. She didn't need to. Because now everyone watching knew this was never going to be just a friendly match. For a long, heavy moment, the dojo stood frozen. Two bodies sprawled on the mat, the crowd holding its collective breath, and Bruce Donovan standing tense, red-faced, with his fists clenched at his sides. His carefully orchestrated plan had just crumbled in front of everyone, and still Vanessa hadn't even raised a fist against him yet. She stood there, calm, composed, and yet utterly commanding. But she wasn't done, not yet. Without a word, Vanessa reached behind her head and pulled the tie from her braid. Slowly, deliberately, her thick hair cascaded down over her shoulders, the movement fluid and graceful. Then, with a quiet authority that drew every gaze, she gathered her hair to one side, exposing the back of her neck. There it was, the tattoo once hidden beneath layers of civilian life, a dark, intricate symbol inked onto her skin. Some in the crowd squinted, unsure what they were seeing, but others, particularly the veterans, the law enforcement officers in attendance, recognized it instantly. The Delta Force insignia. Gasps rippled through the audience. The room was suddenly electric, the air tight and breathless. Vanessa's voice cut through the tension, not loud but sharp and steady enough to slice the room in half. "You're not the first man to try and humiliate me with dirty tricks, Bruce," she said, her tone edged with steel. "But you made the same mistake every one of them did. You underestimated me." Her words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Murmurs surged from the crowd, like the first rolls of distant thunder before a storm. People shifted in their seats, whispered to one another, heads swiveling back and forth between Vanessa and Bruce. Someone near the back pulled out their phone, whispering, "Delta Force, Vanessa Carter. Wait, that can't be her." But they searched anyway, and within moments the whispers turned into audible gasps. "Oh my God, she's real! It's her! It's the Phantom!" Screens lit up all across the dojo as more parents and students followed suit, their curiosity exploding into astonishment. There she was, in grainy photos from old military reports, Rebecca the Phantom Lawson, her former name before she changed it to Carter. Articles mentioned classified missions, hostage rescues in hostile territory, and one headline from over a decade ago. The Phantom operative who saved 7 hostages alone. They read about the mission in Somalia, the extraction in Afghanistan, the unsanctioned rescue of an American journalist that had cost her entire team their lives. Always a shadow, rarely captured on camera, but infamous in the right circles. And now she was standing before them, not in combat gear, not with a rifle in hand, but in sweatpants and a t-shirt, in a small-town dojo, dismantling Bruce Donovan's pride with nothing but precision and presence. The room grew still, not with discomfort, but with reverence. The ones who'd snickered before, who had chuckled when Bruce called her just a history teacher, now stared with wide eyes, their arrogance melting into shame. Bruce's smirk had long since vanished. His face was pale, his jaw tight, eyes darting as he noticed the shift in the air. He could feel the crowd slipping away from him, their loyalty dissolving like mist. Vanessa's gaze locked onto him, unwavering. "You spent all this time judging me by what you could see," she said, her voice still even, still cutting. "But strength doesn't always wear a uniform, Bruce. Sometimes it hides in plain sight." Bruce tried to speak, to summon the bravado that once made students tremble, but nothing came. The room wasn't his anymore. Meanwhile, Malik stood off to the side, his heart pounding, not with fear, but awe. He had known his mother was special, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. His mother wasn't just strong, she was legendary. Across the room, a few parents exchanged glances of disbelief. One man, a retired Marine with silver streaks in his beard, muttered, "I heard of the Phantom back in Kandahar. Ghost stories, we called them. Except she wasn't a story." Another whispered back, "That woman took down insurgent camps solo, and Donovan thought he could beat her with dojo theatrics." The revelation rippled outward, each whispered confirmation building the legend in real time. Vanessa remained still, letting the weight of the truth settle into every heart present. Then she spoke again, softer this time, but no less powerful. You wanted to make me small in front of my son, in front of these children. But all you've done, Bruce, is remind them that you can't measure a person by their appearance, their job, or the color of their skin. True strength lives deeper than that. It always has. Her words weren't just for Bruce. They were for every student, every parent who had sat in that dojo and wondered if they were good enough. Every kid like Malik who'd swallowed quiet indignities, thinking that was just the way of the world. Bruce stood motionless, his breathing shallow. The man who'd strutted like a king only minutes before now looked like a pretender caught without his crown. One of the students stepped forward, a shy, younger black boy named Jordan, who had often been on the receiving end of Bruce's impatience. He stared up at Vanessa, eyes wide with respect. "You're really the Phantom?" he asked, his voice soft. Vanessa turned to him, her expression gentle. She crouched to meet his eye level. "I was," she said, smiling faintly. "But today I'm just Malik's mom, and that's enough." Jordan grinned, his eyes shining. The crowd, watching this exchange, finally broke into scattered applause. Not polite, but genuine, growing louder, spreading from one side of the dojo to the other. It wasn't just for the fight. It was for the truth. Vanessa stood again, facing Bruce one last time. "You wanted to teach me a lesson, Bruce? Consider it learned, but now it's your turn to learn what real strength looks like." And in that charged, echoing silence, everyone finally saw Bruce Donovan for what he was. Not a master, but a man unmasked. The silence hung heavy in the dojo, every eye fixed on Bruce Donovan. He stood like a statue cracked by time and pride, his breath shallow, his fists twitching at his sides. The revelation of Vanessa's identity, the whispers, the applause, it had all shattered something inside him, something he couldn't admit aloud. He wasn't just humiliated. He was exposed. But the kind of man Bruce was, the kind who built his entire life on dominance, on being the biggest presence in every room, didn't know how to retreat, not gracefully, not ever. His pride wouldn't let him walk away. Suddenly, without warning, Bruce roared, an ugly, desperate sound from deep in his throat. He charged forward like a bull, his face twisted with rage, his movements wild and reckless. All pretense of technique, of discipline, was gone. "I'm not finished!" he bellowed. The crowd gasped, some stumbling back, unsure whether to intervene. Malik's breath caught in his chest. For a fleeting moment, even the air seemed to freeze. But not Vanessa. She didn't flinch. She didn't shift. She stood rooted as Bruce stormed toward her, his mass and fury bearing down like a freight train. And just when it seemed he would crash into her, Vanessa moved. Not hurried, not frantic. Precise. She sidestepped just half a beat, pivoted on her heel, and in one smooth, fluid motion, she caught Bruce's momentum with both hands, gripping his arm, guiding his weight forward, then rotating her hips with the ease of muscle memory honed from 1,000 hours of combat training. And then she threw him. With a deft sweep of his arm and a sharp turn of her body, she executed a perfect shoulder throw, one so clean, so effortless, that the force of Bruce's own charge flipped him clean off his feet. His body slammed onto the mat with a heavy, humiliating thud that echoed through the dojo like a verdict. The crowd winced in unison, the sound vibrating deep in their chests. Malik's eyes widened, his heart thundering, not from fear, but awe. Bruce lay sprawled on his back, breath knocked from his lungs, pain radiating from his spine to his pride. He didn't move, couldn't. Vanessa stood over him, calm, composed, the faintest rise and fall of her chest, the only sign she'd even exerted herself. She gazed down at him, eyes steady, voice low but clear enough for every ear in the room to catch. "That," she said softly, "is the fall from arrogance to reality. You're done, Bruce. You've lost." There was no malice in her tone, just truth, delivered clean and sharp like a final cut of a blade. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to gloat. The evidence lay flat on the mat, groaning. Around them, the crowd remained breathless, still absorbing what they'd witnessed. The proud master of the dojo, beaten not by brute force, but by discipline, control, and a strength he never understood. For a heartbeat longer, Vanessa stood there, unmoving, commanding the space. Then, quietly, she stepped back, letting Bruce's defeat speak for itself. In that moment, no one in the room doubted who the real master was. In the days that followed, the dojo didn't quite feel like the same place. The mats were the same, the walls still lined with trophies and faded photographs, but the air had changed, charged with something deeper than respect. It was acknowledgement, reverence. Bruce Donovan didn't return. By the end of the week, the Academy's parent council convened an emergency meeting. The decision was swift and unanimous. No amount of excuses or damage control could patch what had been exposed on that mat. Bruce's pride, his tactics, his quiet prejudice. It was all laid bare before too many witnesses. He was formally removed as head instructor, stripped of his title, his authority, and, perhaps most painfully, his reverence. But while Bruce faded into the background, the conversation within the academy shifted entirely. The students, especially those who had sat under his scrutiny, whispered about Vanessa not as Malik's mom anymore, but as the warrior they never saw coming, the Phantom. Then, quietly but decisively, the parent council approached her. The dojo needed more than new leadership. They needed new guidance, a new compass for what strength should truly mean. They asked Vanessa to stay, to teach, to build not just fighters but thinkers, leaders. At first, she hesitated. She hadn't stepped into a formal teaching role for combat in years. But then she saw Malik watching her from across the room, his eyes filled with a quiet, profound pride. He wasn't just proud, he was inspired. One evening, as they walked home together, Malik finally broke the silence between them. "Mom," he asked, voice soft but sure, "will you teach me, not just the moves, everything, the real stuff?" Vanessa smiled, a warmth blooming in her chest that no battlefield had ever given her. "Of course," she said. "But we don't just learn to fight, Malik. We learn to stand, to carry ourselves with dignity. That's where the real strength is." Back at the dojo, Vanessa began hosting new sessions, not flashy demonstrations of combat, but focused, practical classes on self-defense, mental discipline, situational awareness, and the quiet cultivation of self-respect. The students who had once been overlooked now trained with renewed confidence, their heads higher, their spirits stronger. And at her side always was Malik, her first student, her greatest reason for stepping back into the light. The dojo was no longer just a place to throw punches. It had become a space of transformation, of learning that real power came not from how hard you could hit, but from knowing who you were when the world tried to make you forget. And for Vanessa Carter, for the Phantom, the mission wasn't war anymore. It was legacy. Months passed, but the echoes of that fateful night at the dojo never truly faded. What began as a challenge had grown into a reckoning, not just for Bruce Donovan, but for the entire academy. Under new leadership, with Vanessa guiding the heart of its mission, Donovan Martial Arts Academy transformed. The walls that once seemed to echo only with pride and exclusion now carried new sounds of empowerment, of confidence, of students of every background standing side by side, learning not just how to fight, but how to carry themselves in a world that didn't always play fair. Vanessa made sure of that. She taught them how to fall, yes, but more importantly, how to get back up. She taught them that strength wasn't just found in fists or flashy kicks, but in how you faced life's blows without folding. At the end of every session, Vanessa gathered her students, young and old, novice and advanced, and reminded them of one truth that no opponent could take away. Strength isn't about who hits harder or faster, she'd say, her voice calm but resonant. It's about who can stand their ground when the world tries to knock them down. It's about standing firm in the face of injustice and not letting it break you. Those words became the new creed of the academy. Painted in bold letters across the wall, they served as a daily reminder of what the dojo now represented, a home for fairness, resilience, and dignity. Vanessa didn't seek recognition, but she became a symbol, proof that the quietest person in the room might just carry the heaviest truth. Malik, now taller, stronger, and more self-assured, walked those mats every day with his head high, proud of the mother who had shown him what real power looked like. And so the dojo stood, not just as a place to train warriors, but as a beacon of diversity, respect, and unshakable strength. A place where every student, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like, was reminded that their worth was never up for debate. Vanessa smiled every time she watched them train. She knew her battles weren't over. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. She was building an army of hearts that wouldn't break. And as Vanessa stood by the edge of the mat, watching students of all colors, sizes, and strengths train together in unity, she understood the greater purpose of her return. Life wasn't about proving who could hit the hardest. It was about proving who could endure, who could stand up after being pushed down, and who could carry others when the weight of injustice tried to keep them low. That's the lesson life often teaches us when we least expect it. True strength is not about domination, but about dignity. About refusing to let the world define your worth based on your past, your appearance, or your pain. For many of us, especially as we grow older, it's easy to believe our best days are behind us, that we've had our time to stand tall. But the truth is, every chapter of life carries the chance to rise again, to make a stand not just for ourselves, but for the generations watching. We all face battles. Some are loud and public, others are quiet and personal. But the question is never whether we will face them. The question is whether we'll face them with grace, with courage, and with the kind of strength that can't be measured by muscles alone. Vanessa's story reminds us that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, to demand respect, and to teach others the power of integrity. And perhaps that's the most valuable legacy any of us can leave behind. Not the trophies on a shelf, but the hearts we strengthen, the minds we open, and the dignity we pass forward. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength or inspired you to stand a little taller, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your perspective. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you won't miss the next story that stirs your soul. We have so many more to share, stories of resilience, justice, and the everyday heroes we often overlook. Because in the end, it's not about how many times we fall. It's about how many times we rise and who we become in the process.